Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. And today we are discussing the types of home inspections that you may want to consider doing if you are thinking about purchasing a home here in Maryland so that you are well protected through the home purchasing process. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Living in Maryland channel where we discuss all things living here in the great state of Maryland. So if that's the kind of information that you are after, then you are definitely in the right spot and we really appreciate you being here. And if you are thinking about making a move here to Maryland, if you're wondering whether purchasing a home is the right decision for you, we absolutely love having those conversations and helping out in any way possible. So however you feel comfortable reaching out, whether that's by phone, text, or email, days, nights, and weekends, we've got your back when moving here to the great state of Maryland. All right, so today we are talking about the home inspection process and the types of home inspections that you may want to consider doing here in Maryland. And there's a couple things that I would like to point out to people when we're discussing this part of the process in regards to purchasing a home. So in Maryland, when you are doing home inspections, there's a few things that you want to know about our addendum. One is that it is timeline. So inspections are always timeline. It's something that is going to be negotiated within the contract as far as how many days the buyer has from the day that the seller and the buyer fully agree on the offer up front. And then from there, how many days they have to complete any and all inspections that are agreed upon within the inspections addendum. So a very common timeline is 7 to 10 days, and I'll speak to this a little further here in a second. So if it's 10 days, that means from the date of the fully accepted offer, the buyer has to have all inspections done within 10 days and any repairs that they're going to request in the hands of the sellers by the end of the day on day 10, or else that right to inspect and to ask for repairs is no longer a protection within the contract. Two is that our inspections, it's not just kind of like blanket, like do any and all inspections you want. The addendum does require that you specify the types of inspections that you do, and I'm going to actually walk you through those different types of inspections so you know exactly what you have the right to inspect for here in Maryland with our contract. All right, so now I'm going to pull up actually an image of page 1 of our inspections addendum so you can actually see exactly what this looks like that we include in our contract of sales specific to inspections. So you can see kind of the breakdown of all the different options you have when you're purchasing a home here in Maryland. And if you see me looking down, it's just because I'm following along. I want to make sure I don't miss anything, so I'm looking at this stuff exactly how you see it. So you can see there on paragraph 1, it speaks to the inspection contingency, and then it gives an opportunity for you to put in the number of days that the buyer has to conduct all these inspections. So that's very important. This is something that I'm having a thorough conversation with people on to make sure that everyone's aware of this up front, right? The last thing we want is to get under contract and then you're told, oh, you only have 5 days, oh, you only have 7 days, and then you feel like you have to scramble. So having this conversation up front as you're discussing the terms and conditions of your offer, but before you actually submit it to the seller, so everyone's on the same page and you as the buyer know how many days you have to conduct these inspections. All right, and then as we move a little below that into paragraph A, you're gonna start to see how the addendum here itemizes the different types of inspections that you as the buyer have the right to do. Now the first one is structural mechanical. This is just basically a general home inspection. So this is where you have a general home inspector come through, and this is what everyone is probably, most people think of when they think of a home inspection, is where the inspector's gonna hop on the roof, they're gonna get in the attic, they're gonna check everything basically top to bottom in that home and give you a detailed report of exactly what the function is, what the condition is, so you know what you're walking into. In a general home inspection, they're also gonna check all appliances, typically give you serial numbers, ages of those appliances. They're gonna run and test the HVAC, check all windows, stress test the plumbing, check out the foundation and the exterior of the property, and give you a detailed analysis and report of what that property looks like. And it's not uncommon for these home inspection reports to run anywhere from 30 to 45 pages depending on the inspector. So these are fairly in-depth and they do check a lot of things as they're going through this inspection. All right, the next item is going to be mold. Now, to be honest with you, It's very uncommon. I very rarely see anyone ask for this within the contract to inspect. A lot of times when I have seen it, it's because we've visually seen mold during the showing, and it's something that we know ahead of time we're going to be going in there and inspecting for. So, but if it's something that we don't necessarily suspect of going into the offer, it's typically not something that is that the buyer is asking for. Now, of course, you always have the right to do that. It's totally up to the buyer and their comfort level. But in my experience, just kind of seeing a lot of contracts, it's not something that is typically asked for up front if there's not known knowledge going in that there is mold. Because a general home inspector, under the structural mechanical can call out discoloration, some type of growth, and it can still be addressed under the general structural and mechanical inspection. So that's typically why in kind of day-to-day practice you don't see that initialed off and checked on most contracts. Next is environmental. This is another one that I don't see a lot of buyers asking for when they are submitting offers. This would be if you're going in to the contract and the property knowing you maybe want to inspect for like air quality and stuff like that, and it's just not something that we typically see day to day with buyers' offers. So, but that is something that you have the right for, and just kind of knowing that that's part of the addendum is helpful as well. Next is going to be radon. This is something that I always recommend that people do. It's fairly affordable. With the inspectors that I use, I typically see it around $100. Additional cost, especially when you bundle it with a general structural mechanical inspection. So it's not too bad. This is a gas that we have here in the Maryland region and all throughout our region, but we do have it here in Maryland. So it's a gas that comes up through the soil that the EPA does recommend that you try to be aware of and that you know where those levels are at. According to the EPA guidelines, if the levels are below 4.0, it doesn't necessarily recommend remediation, so it should be okay. If it's above 4.0, that is where the EPA does recommend remediation. These companies can come in and typically they tie into the sump pump, or they drill into the foundation with typically a 3-inch PVC pipe, and it's going to have a 24/7 fan basically sucking air out below the foundation and then spitting it to the exterior of the property to keep the levels low. It's roughly about a $1,200 remediation system, so if the levels are high, and this is included in the contract as a right for the buyer to inspect, then we can get the seller to make that correction. So that's why it's definitely important to make sure that it doesn't fall on the buyer. All right, next is a chimney inspection, and this is another one that I don't see a lot of times initialed off and checked by a buyer. But if you plan on purchasing a home with a chimney and you plan on using it, this is probably something you definitely want to do, because in my experience, general home inspectors, they're not getting extremely detailed into inspecting the chimney. They're gonna usually check the flue to make sure that that's functional. From the inside, when they're on the roof, they're going to check the flashing and make sure everything looks good there to make sure that there's likely not water penetration, because that is a common point of entry for water. But outside of that, they're not typically giving a lot of analysis on the chimney. So they're not going to be able to tell you how the chimney liner looks or give you any kind of details as far as functionality of the chimney. So if you plan to actively use the chimney, this is something that I would recommend that you make sure to include in your offer. And next is lead-based paint. This is something that at a federal level is required a disclosure if the home is built in 1978 or before. So if it's built after that, you don't need to worry about this. It's not something that's going to be applicable to the property. Then they would have stopped using that type of paint before, so it's not going to be necessarily a threat. If it's built 1978 or before, this is something that you can consider inspecting for. A lot of people, again, in my experience, they don't typically include this. It's not, I guess, a concern to a lot of people. It is something I try to point out, like if you see newer windows, if the home's built in like 1975 and there's newer windows and it's been painted semi-recently, most people don't tend to be concerned in that situation. If we're looking at a home that's built in 1945, it's got original paint, it's got wood windows, then that would be something where, especially me as my role, I would step in and say this is something you probably want to consider, and in that situation it's probably better to do that inspection and specify for it. So depending on the situation, this is something that you can kind of gauge whether you want to inspect for as a as an individual inspection, but something to be aware of as well, especially if the property is built before 1978. All right, next is wood destroying insects. And this is definitely something I always recommend. It's very, very affordable. It's typically 50 to 65 bucks, especially when you bundle it with a, inspection. But even like say a pest now is typically no more than 50 bucks to get someone out there and tell you what the situation is with wood destroying insects. And most of the time, even me, like up to a few years ago, I just always thought of, termites and that was it. But then I had a couple reports call out, carpenter bees. So that's another one that you want to be aware of, and carpenter ants. So those are kind of the big three that you may see, and just to make sure that there's no issues with that, because that's something that you don't want to mess with down the road. Now, I will say VA is the only loan type that requires this. So they actually require it by the underwriter for the financing. If you are getting a conventional loan, an FHA loan, the lender's not going to ask you for this. So this is kind of on you to make sure that you do. And this is something I always recommend up front that we include in the contract, but it's not something that you have. It's not something that you absolutely have to get. So it's just something to be aware of, to make sure, if it is important to you, that we do include that here in the addendum, to make sure you have the right to inspect for it and ask for repairs from the seller. All right, next is the additional inspection section. And this is where, it's hard to say exactly what that could look like from agent to agent and buyer to buyer, what could be put in there. I can give you a couple examples. A lot of times we see this left blank, to be honest with you. But depending on the property and depending on the buyer, you have the opportunity to input some things here depending on what you want done. One example I can give you is if maybe you want the main sewer line actually cameraed or scoped to see kind of exactly what that looks like. They can stick a camera down there and see if there's any breaks in the line, cracks, roots getting into the main line. So that's going to be above and beyond what a general structural mechanical inspection would include. So if you wanted to include that, that's an example of something that might be a little gray. Like if you were to do that without the seller's knowledge and then ask for repairs, who knows? Maybe they say, well, you don't have the right to do that because it's not included in the addendum. So that would be something just to avoid any kind of gray area, to include it there. So that would be an example. Maybe you go and you're looking at a home and it's a fixer-upper, and we notice some things with the foundation going into that purchase. So maybe we include in there to have the foundation looked at by a structural engineer. So to really specify that, to make sure that there's no confusion, to make sure that there's no issues come potential negotiations with the seller once you're under contract. So that's a couple examples of what you could put in there, and this is going to vary and depend on the property and the situation, but that's kind of something you can expect as an example of what could go there. And then next, I do want to specify, if you are looking at a property with well and septic, these are additional systems that you do own as the property owner if the property has it. So you want to absolutely make sure you're inspecting for those. And those do come, at an additional cost. So that's something that you want to be, having conversations around, so you're prepared for what that looks like. And those also have separate addendums, so they're not going to be covered in this inspection addendum that I'm showing you here. So those are going to have, the well is going to have their own, where you can tell the seller you're going to inspect for, you're going to check the well yield to see how many gallons per minute it's producing, and you're also going to inspect the well overall. And then the septic is going to have its own separate addendum as well, to make sure you can evaluate that and make sure that that's all looking good, and get the specifics from the county, from the public records, and see what's going on there. So just know, if you are looking at a property with well and septic, there are additional inspections that speak very specifically to those items. All right, and then last but not least, the thing that I love about our most recent updates to our contracts here. So every year in Maryland, in October, we get some updates on what's coming. A lot of times it's very, small updates. It's not very, huge, but our inspection addendum, the one that I'm showing you here today, had a pretty, significant change in regards to termination specific to inspections. So that's what I'm speaking to here now. So what that means is, what happens if something comes up? What happens if the seller, won't fix it? What are my rights to walk away and get my deposit back? Where with our old contract, or with our old inspection addendum, there was not a general right to terminate. You had to basically go through the motions of asking the seller to make repairs. They would have to say no in order to open that door for you to walk away. So you had to ask first, you had to go through that process. But now our contract gives the buyer a general right to terminate, which just makes it so much cleaner and more protective for the buyer, which I absolutely love. So I'm going to read you that paragraph so you know exactly what that looks like. So it says, right to terminate. If the results of an inspection are unsatisfactory to the buyer may terminate the contract of sale by delivering a notice of termination under contract of sale to the seller by the deadline. So it's got to be within that timeline that we were talking about in the beginning. The buyer is not required to specify the basis of the buyer's dissatisfaction. The buyer's right to terminate the contract of sale as stated in this section or subsection expires at the deadline. So basically what that means is you don't have to give the seller a reason, and you can cancel at any time within that agreed amount timeline there at the top of the page 1 in regards to your time frame to do inspections and complete inspections. So this just makes it so clean. If you even change your mind, if you see something that you don't like, if you see something that was totally caught off guard that we didn't notice in the showings, you have the full right and protection within this contract to walk away and to get your deposit back. So something that's very nice and just makes it very clean and protective for buyers. All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you ever need anything or have any questions at all, I'm always available, and we'll see you at the next video.